The moment Opal Atwood walked through the double doors of the Cattlemen's Hall in Abilene, Kansas, in the sweltering July of 1873, every single conversation in that smoke-filled room died like a candle snuffed between two wet fingers. She had expected that. She had dressed for it, in fact, not to impress, but to command. Her riding skirt was a deep charcoal wool, her ivory blouse buttoned to the collar despite the heat, and her auburn hair was pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to her father before the fever took him 6 weeks prior. She carried a leather satchel in one hand and a folded contract in the other, and she walked to the long oak table at the center of the room, as though she had been doing it every year of her life. She had not. This was the first time in the 32 years of the Atwood cattle enterprise that a woman had attended the annual Abilene negotiation. It was the first time in her own 26 years that she had been the one to represent anything beyond her kitchen or her garden. But her father was dead, her younger brother was 17 and not yet ready, and the ranch would not survive another season if she did not secure a fair contract with the rail buyers today. There were 11 men seated around that table. Buyers from the Kansas Pacific Railroad, independent beef brokers from Chicago, 2 ranchers from neighboring spreads who had come to observe, a land agent named Calhoun who always seemed to be present wherever money changed hands, and at the far end of the table, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed and his hat tilted just slightly forward over his brow, was a man she did not recognize. He was watching her. Not the way the others were watching her, not with the pinched discomfort of men who felt their territory threatened, not with the smirking amusement of men who had already decided she would fail. He was watching her the way a man watches something he cannot quite categorize, something that demands his full attention precisely because it does not fit any of the boxes he has built in his mind. She did not look at him for long. She had work to do. "Gentlemen," she said, setting her satchel on the table and drawing the chair at the head of it, the one that had always been her father's, "My name is Opal Atwood. My father, Henry Atwood, passed 6 weeks ago. I am the legal owner of the Atwood Ranch, 1,200 acres southeast of Dodge City, and I am here to negotiate the sale of 460 head of prime Longhorn cattle. I trust none of you will waste my time, and I certainly will not waste yours." The silence that followed was not entirely hostile. It was more the silence of recalibration, of men who had walked into a room expecting one thing and found another entirely. Silas Brandt, the lead buyer for the Kansas Pacific, cleared his throat. He was a large man with a red beard and the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone he considered worth knowing. "Miss Atwood," he began, with an emphasis on the miss that was unmistakably deliberate, "we were expecting your father." "My father is dead," she said simply. "I am here instead. Unless you would prefer to conduct your business with a headstone, I suggest we proceed." Someone at the table, she thought it was one of the Chicago brokers, made a sound that was either a cough or a suppressed laugh. She did not look to find out which. What she did notice in the edge of her vision was that the man at the far end of the table had straightened slightly in his chair. The hat was no longer tilted forward. He was fully upright now, and he was still watching her. The negotiation began in earnest. Silas Brandt opened with an offer of $3.40 per head, which was so insultingly low that Opal had to press her thumbnail into her palm beneath the table to keep from showing any reaction. She had done her research. She had spent the 3 weeks following her father's funeral doing nothing but research, reading every copy of the livestock market report she could lay her hands on, writing letters to cattle brokers in Kansas City, consulting with old Tom Pierce who had been trail driving cattle since before she was born. She knew what the market was bearing. She knew what the railroad needed. She knew what leverage she had. $3.40 is a winter price for spring cattle," she said. "These are summer longhorns, trail-driven, weight-gained, already culled of the week. I'm asking $4.15 per head." "4.15 is a fantasy price," Brandt said flatly. "It is the price your competitors in Chicago paid last Thursday," she replied, opening her satchel and sliding a folded telegram across the table. "I have the wire from Marcus Field's brokerage. $4.12. I am asking 3 cents above that, and given that my herd does not require the additional freight costs that a Chicago purchase does, you are still coming out advantaged." The telegram landed in front of Brant like a thrown gauntlet. The room shifted. She could feel it, the subtle change in barometric pressure that happens when a negotiation stops being a formality and starts being real. From the far end of the table, she heard a low, quiet voice say, "She's right about the freight differential." Everyone turned. The man who had been watching her had spoken for the first time. He sat forward now, both forearms resting on the table, and she could see him more clearly than she had before. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two older, with the kind of sun-darkened complexion that came from years under an open sky rather than from any vanity. His jaw was angular, his dark hair worn slightly long beneath the hat he had now removed and set on the table beside him. His eyes, she noticed with some involuntary precision, were a particular shade of gray-green that reminded her of sagebrush after rain. "I wasn't aware your opinion had been solicited, Fletcher," Brant said. "So his name was Fletcher." "It hasn't," the man said, with a calm that somehow made the words feel more, not less, pointed. "But Miss Atwood's arithmetic is sound, and I thought someone at this table ought to acknowledge that before we waste the rest of the afternoon pretending it isn't." Brant's jaw tightened. "You're here to observe on behalf of your employer, not to participate in the negotiation. My employer will want to know whether this transaction was conducted in good faith," Fletcher said. "I am merely noting for the record that it would be." Opal filed this away. Fletcher, an observer representing someone else, with enough standing to challenge Brant without apparent consequence. She would think about it later. Right now, she had to keep her momentum. $4.15, she repeated, meeting Brant's eyes across the table. "With full delivery to the Abilene stockyards by the end of August and the Atwood brand certificate attached to every bill of sale." Brant picked up the telegram. He read it. He set it down. He looked at the broker to his left, a thin man named Hargrove, who gave the smallest possible nod. He looked back at Opal. $4 even," he said. She did not move, did not blink, did not betray by so much as a flicker of her eyelashes that $4 per head was already more than she had dared to hope for when she left the ranch 4 days ago. $4.10, she said, "and you cover the cost of the Abilene stockyard fees." Brant stared at her for a long moment. Then, with the air of a man conceding a chess match to an opponent he had severely underestimated, he extended his hand across the table. $4.10 and the yard fees," he said. "You have a deal, Miss Atwood." She shook his hand. Her grip was firm and her face was composed, and everything inside her was screaming with relief and triumph and grief all at once, because her father should have been the one sitting in this chair, and the fact that he was not was the most terrible and the most clarifying thing that had ever happened to her. When the formal paperwork began to circulate, Opal allowed herself to exhale. She accepted a glass of water from the young man who served refreshments at the hall. She signed her name 4 times in her careful, deliberate hand, and she tried not to think about how her fingers were trembling. She failed at the last part. "You negotiated well." She looked up. James Fletcher had come around the table at some point during the paper signing, and he was now standing approximately 3 feet to her left, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to be respectful. He held his hat in both hands, turning it slowly by the brim in a way that suggested he was either nervous or simply had no place else to put his hands. "Thank you," she said. "That telegram was a smart move," he said. Brant doesn't respond to argument. He responds to evidence. You gave him evidence he couldn't refute. She looked at him more directly than she had allowed herself to before. He had an honest face, not handsome in the theatrical way of the dime novel illustrations she had seen, but genuinely, substantially honest, as though the bones of him were incapable of deception. There was something in his expression that was careful, almost as though he was measuring each word before releasing it. "You said you were here on behalf of your employer," she said. "Who is your employer, Mr. Fletcher?" "Samuel Crane," he said. "Crane Cattlemen out of Fort Worth. He's considering purchasing grazing rights from the Atwood spread's neighboring parcel, the Ridley land." She stiffened slightly. "The Ridley parcel borders my eastern fence line." "I know," he said. "That's why Mr. Crane wanted someone present today, to get a sense of who he might be dealing with as a neighbor." She studied him. "And what sense have you gotten?" His mouth curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but something in the family of one. "That whoever ends up neighboring the Atwood ranch is going to need to bring their best game," he said. It was not flirtation. Not exactly. But it was something, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of a fire on the far side of a dark field, not near enough to warm you, but near enough to notice. "I am not in the habit of making trouble for my neighbors," she said, "as long as they don't make trouble for me." "That seems eminently reasonable," he said. A pause settled between them, the kind of pause that was not quite empty. Around them, the negotiation room was beginning to thin as men collected their papers and their hats and drifted toward the door. Brant had already left. The Chicago brokers were deep in conversation with Hargrove. The land agent Calhoun was watching Opal and Fletcher from across the room with an expression she disliked, without being able to specify why. "I heard about your father," Fletcher said quietly. "Henry Atwood had a good reputation in the trade." The words landed on a soft spot she had not been guarding. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm again. "He was a fair man," she said, "and a good rancher. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said, and this time the words were smaller, less armored. He nodded. He seemed to understand that there was nothing more useful to say on the subject, which was itself a kind of intelligence she had not expected. Men, in her experience, either avoided the topic of grief entirely or flooded it with clumsy sentiment. He simply acknowledged it and let it rest. "Miss Atwood," he said, returning his hat to his head with the particular gesture of a man preparing to leave. "I don't suppose you'd allow me to buy you supper this evening. I have some questions about the eastern boundary situation that would be better addressed in conversation than in formal correspondence." She looked at him. The hat was back on now, and she missed, briefly and unreasonably, being able to see his dark hair. "Business conversation," she said. "Entirely," he said. Then, with the faintest return of that near smile, "To begin with." She held his gaze for one deliberate moment, long enough to make clear that she had heard both the business offer and the one beneath it, and that she was choosing to respond only to the first. "The Grand Hotel has a dining room," she said. 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, he agreed, and turned toward the door. She watched him go. She watched the way he moved through the room, not with the swagger of men who needed their presence felt, but with a quiet, grounded certainty, as though he knew exactly where he was and where he was going and was in no particular hurry to prove it to anyone. Then she picked up her satchel, tucked her copy of the signed contract carefully inside it, and walked out of the cattlemen's hall into the white heat of the Abilene afternoon. The Grand Hotel's dining room was the finest establishment Opal had visited in years. The tablecloths were actual linen, not the oilcloth that covered every surface at the eating houses along the cattle drive routes. There were oil lamps on each table with glass chimneys that were kept clean. A piano player in the corner was working through something that was not quite classical and not quite saloon music, landing in the civilized middle ground that establishments like this cultivated deliberately. Opal had returned to her hotel room, a modest boarding house 2 streets over from the Grand, since the Atwood finances were not yet in a position to afford Grand Hotel prices, and she had changed out of her negotiating clothes into the only dinner dress she had brought. It was a deep green that had been her mother's color choice, and she wore it without the formality of a hat, her auburn hair dressed more softly than it had been that morning. She was aware, as she walked into the dining room and saw James Fletcher rise from the table where he had been waiting, that she had taken some care with her appearance. She was also aware that she was not entirely certain whether that care was for herself, for the ongoing business impression, or for him specifically? She chose not to examine the question too closely. He had changed as well, a clean white shirt, a dark vest, his hair brushed back from his face. He looked, she thought, like a man who had made an effort, and the effort pleased her more than she had anticipated. "Miss Atwood," he said, pulling out her chair before the hotel's dining room attendant could reach it. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for asking," she said, sitting down and spreading the linen napkin across her lap with the automatic neatness of someone who had been trained in table manners, and could not abandon them even at the end of an exhausting day. They ordered from the menu, which offered roasted beef, potato preparations, and what the hotel called summer vegetables, which turned out to be a reasonably respectable arrangement of corn and green beans. The wine the attendant suggested was adequate. The coffee, when it came later, was excellent. For the first half-hour they talked business. She explained the lay of the Atwood land, the eastern fence line, the creek that ran along the boundary and was therefore technically shared water. He asked intelligent questions about grazing capacity and seasonal forage, and she answered them fully and without condescension, because it was clear that he knew enough about the subject to recognize a deflection if she offered one. She found herself liking the quality of his questions. They were specific where they needed to be specific, and they were also genuinely curious, not a lawyer's interrogation but a rancher's interest, and she had grown up around ranchers and could feel the difference. "You know cattle," she said at one point, more as an observation than a compliment. "I grew up on a ranch in Texas," he said, "near Lampasas. My family ran Longhorns for 15 years before I went to work for Crane. Do you prefer working for Crane to running your own operation?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his water glass slightly in its ring on the tablecloth. "I prefer the work to be done well," he said. "Whether it's my ranch or someone else's, that part matters more to me than the ownership." She considered this. It was a more honest answer than she had expected. Most men of her acquaintance, when asked about ownership and ambition, gave her the speech about their plans and their futures and their destinies. This man had simply told her the truth about what he valued. "My father used to say that a man who loves the work is worth more than a man who loves the result," she offered. "Your father was right," he said, and then more quietly, "He raised someone who loves the work too. I could see that today. The way you prepared, that wasn't someone working for a result. That was someone who cares about the doing of it." She met his eyes across the table. The oil lamp between them made the light warm and shifting, and his gray-green eyes in that light were something she was going to have difficulty not thinking about later in the privacy of her boarding house room. "I prepared because I had to," she said. "Because the alternative was failure, and failure meant my brother's inheritance, and my father's life's work gone before either of them could properly rest." "I know," he said. "But not everyone responds to necessity with excellence. Some people just do enough. You went further." She looked away from him, not because the words were unwelcome but because they were too welcome, and she needed a moment to keep herself organized. "Tell me about this business with the Ridley parcel," she said, returning to the safer territory of commerce. He told her. Samuel Crane was looking to expand his northern operations, and the Ridley parcel, 1,000 acres that old Walt Ridley had let go fallow after his wife died, was an attractive piece of land. The grazing was good, there was a natural windbreak along the northern ridge, and the proximity to the cattle trail that ran past the Atwood spread made it strategically sound. "The issue is water," she said. "The issue is always water," he agreed. The creek that formed the eastern boundary of the Atwood land fed a pond on the Ridley side that was, in normal years, adequate for perhaps 200 head. Crane was talking about running 500. "That will strain the water table on my side," she said. "I know," he said, "which is why I wanted to talk to you directly rather than letting the lawyers work it out after the purchase." She sat back slightly in her chair, studying him. "You're telling me you've already decided how this should be resolved." "I'm telling you I think we might find a solution that works for both operations," he said. There's a natural channel about 200 yards north of the current pond that could be developed into a second water source for the Ridley side. It would take some work and some expense, but it would eliminate the strain on the shared table. Who bears the expense? Crane would, he said. As the new party introducing the strain, it's fair that he bear the cost of solving it. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the dining room's front windows, the street was darkening into Abilene's evening business, cowboys in from the trail, a few saloon doors swinging, the intermittent sound of horses and laughter, and the low general noise of a town that never quite stopped. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, "why would you come to me with this arrangement before the purchase is even final? Crane hasn't bought the Ridley parcel yet. He has no obligation to negotiate with me about water access." "No," he agreed. "He doesn't." "Then why?" "Because I told him he should," Fletcher said. "Because I think starting a neighboring relationship with deception and legal ambiguity is a bad business practice and a worse way to treat a person." She looked at him for a long moment. "Does Mr. Crane often take your advice on matters of ethics?" she asked. "More often than you might expect," he said. "He's a hard man in some ways, but he's not fundamentally dishonest. He just needs someone to point out when the short-term advantage is going to cost him in the long run. And you are that person." "Apparently," he said, with a dry self-awareness that made her smile despite herself. She felt the smile happen, and she did not fight it. It was the first smile that had felt fully natural on her face in 6 weeks, and she was aware of that in the same way you are aware of the first rain after a drought, not sentimental about it, but profoundly grateful. "I would want the agreement about the channel in writing," she said, "before Crane closes on the Ridley parcel." "I expected nothing less," he said. "And I would want right of inspection, the ability to verify that the channel is developed to sufficient capacity within the agreed timeframe. Also reasonable. And if the channel proves inadequate, I want a reduction in the permitted head count on the Ridley side until the problem is remedied." "I'll bring that back to Crane," he said, "but my inclination is yes on all three." She nodded. She picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands, enjoying the warmth. "You're good at this," she said. "At what?" "At being fair," she said. "It's rarer than it should be." He looked at her with an expression she did not entirely know how to read, something serious and still, like a man who has just heard a thing he did not know he needed to hear. "So are you," he said. The piano in the corner had shifted to something slower and more melodic. Most of the other diners had gone. The attendant was beginning to dim the lamps at the far end of the room with the gentle persistence of staff who needed the guests to understand that the evening was concluding. Opal became aware that she did not want to leave. This was a new and somewhat alarming realization. She was 26 years old. She had been engaged once and it had ended badly. She had spent the last 4 years building the practical architecture of her life around the certainty that love was a luxury she could not afford when there were cattle to feed and accounts to balance. She was not the kind of woman who sat across a candle-lit table from a man she had known for 8 hours and felt the specific gravity of not wanting the evening to end. And yet, "I should go," she said, setting down her coffee cup with the precision of someone who has made a decision and intends to act on it. "It's been a long day and I have an early stage departure tomorrow." He rose immediately, pulling back her chair as she stood. His manners were not performed, they were simply present, the way breathing was present. She found this particular quality in him disproportionately appealing, and she filed it away alongside the color of his eyes as things she was going to think about more than she should. "I'll have the written agreement drafted by tomorrow morning," he said. "I can have it to your boarding house before 8. "How did you know where I was staying?" "The Thornton house," he said. "It's where anyone staying in Abilene on a working budget stays. I'm 2 rooms down the hall, actually." She absorbed this information. 2 rooms down the hall. 7:30 would be better, she said. "I want time to read it before the stage." 7:30, he said. They walked out of the dining room together. The hotel lobby was quiet at this hour, a desk clerk nodding over his ledger, a pair of traveling salesmen discussing something in low voices by the front window. Outside, the street was still alive with Cattletown night activity, and the warm July air settled around them as they stepped out. "The Thornton house is 3 blocks north," he said. "I know where it is," she said. "I know you do," he said, and he said it without condescension, just as a simple acknowledgement of a competent person's competence. "I was offering to walk you there. Abilene at night is not always polite." She looked at him. He was not making the offer out of the belief that she could not manage 3 blocks on her own. He was making it because he wished to extend the evening, and he was honest enough in his manner not to disguise the reason with elaborate justification. She appreciated the honesty more than was wise. "Thank you," she said. They walked north along the main street of Abilene, Kansas, on a warm July night in 1873, and they talked about smaller things than they had been talking about all evening: the particular strangeness of Abilene as a town that was simultaneously frontier and commerce, the way the cattle trade had built it up, and the way the new farming settlements were beginning to push back against the cattle drives, what the next decade would look like for the whole enterprise of Western ranching. He had opinions, and he offered them with confidence but without insistence, and he asked for her opinions in return in a way that made clear he genuinely wanted to hear them. She had not been asked for her opinions in quite that way for a long time. At the door of the Thornton house they stopped. The street here was quieter. A dog was sleeping against the base of the hitching post outside. Overhead, the sky was extravagantly full of stars, the kind of sky that was only possible far from the gas-lit streets of cities. "Thank you for supper," she said. "Thank you for the company," he said. "It was considerably better than I expected." She laughed. It was a small laugh, quick and genuine. "What were you expecting?" "Honestly, I expected you to be formidable and exhausted and not particularly interested in conversation." "I am formidable and exhausted," she said. "You are," he agreed, "but the not interested in conversation part was wrong." She smiled again, and this time she let it settle on her face a little longer. "Good night, Mr. Fletcher." "Good night, Miss Atwood," he said. "I'll see you at 7:30. She went inside. She climbed the stairs to her room. She changed into her nightgown. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for several minutes, not quite thinking about anything in particular, which was itself a way of thinking about something specific. James Fletcher was 2 rooms down this hallway. He was honest and competent and careful with words, and had gray-green eyes, and had stood up in a room full of powerful men to confirm her arithmetic. He was also, at least temporarily, connected to the business affairs of her ranch through the Ridley parcel question. She lay down and told herself very firmly that she was tired, and that the events of the day had simply been remarkable, and that the way she felt was gratitude and relief, nothing more complicated than that. She did not quite believe herself, but she fell asleep anyway. He was at her door at 7:25, which told her something about him. A man who arrived at 7:25 for a 7:30 appointment had left his room early enough to account for all contingencies. He had the agreement in his hand, 2 pages, written in a clean, clear hand rather than the cramped legal script she had expected. "You wrote this yourself," she said, looking at it. "The hotel has a writing desk," he said. "I didn't have a lawyer available." "It's well drafted," she said, reading through it carefully while he stood in the hallway with his hat in his hands in the same gesture she had noticed yesterday. "You've included everything we discussed." "And the inspection right is Clause 4, he said, without her having to ask. She read Clause 4. It was exactly right. She looked up at him. "I'll need to have my own lawyer confirm this is binding under Kansas territorial law before I sign." "Naturally," he said. "I'll send you the final version from Fort Worth after Crane reviews it with his signature and a copy for your solicitor." "I don't have a solicitor," she said. "I use Judge Beeman in Dodge City. He's not technically a solicitor, but he knows the law well enough." "Judge Beeman will be fine," he said. "I'll have it to him within 3 weeks." She handed the draft back to him. The hallway of the Thornton house was narrow, and he was close enough that she could see the careful line of his shave, close enough that the morning light coming through the hallway window caught the angle of his jaw in a way she was going to have difficulty explaining as anything other than attractive. "Mr. Fletcher," she said. "James," he said, and then with a faint expression of having surprised himself, "if you're willing, we've been negotiating each other's water rights. It seems unnecessarily formal." "Opal," she said. He smiled. A full smile this time, not the near version she had been cataloging. It changed his face considerably, something opened in it, some reserve that was usually carefully maintained. It was the smile of a man who was genuinely, uncomplicatedly pleased. She felt it land somewhere in her chest with a specificity she was not prepared for. "Safe travels," he said. "I hope the stage is better than the one from Dodge." The stage from Dodge had a broken spring and a man who talked about his mule for 4 hours, she said. "Then the bar is low," he said. She laughed again and picked up her satchel and went downstairs and out into the Abilene morning. On the stage back toward Dodge City, with the Kansas grassland rolling past the windows in the late summer gold that she had loved all her life, Opal Atwood sat with the signed contract in her satchel, and $4.10 per head secured for 460 head of cattle. And she thought about water rights agreements and gray-green eyes, and the specific quality of a man who asks for your opinion because he genuinely wants it. She also thought, with a practicality that was both her inheritance and her survival strategy, about the 3 weeks it would take for the Ridley parcel paperwork to arrive in Dodge City. 3 weeks was not very long. When she arrived home, the ranch received her with the particular welcome of a place that has been waiting. Her brother Cole, 17 and already nearly as tall as their father had been, still wearing his grief like an ill-fitting coat, came out of the barn when he heard the stage and looked at her with the anxious expression he had been wearing since the funeral. "How did it go?" he asked. She told him. She watched his face change as the numbers registered, 410 per head, yard fees covered, delivery by end of August. She watched him do the arithmetic, and she watched the moment when he understood what it meant. The outstanding debt on the south pasture fence. The cost of the winter feed stockpile, the repair the north pump needed, all of it and something beyond it. Pa would have gotten $4 flat, Cole said, and it was the most complicated sentence he had probably ever said, full of pride and grief and something that was not quite resentment but was close to the shape of it. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe he would have done the same thing. He taught me everything I know." Cole nodded. He took her horse's bridle when she dismounted, and he led it toward the barn, and she thought that he was going to be a good man when the awkward years were done, and that she needed to make sure the ranch was still standing when he was ready to come into his own. There was a great deal of work to do. The next 3 weeks were the kind of work that fills a person completely. The organizing of the cattle drive to Abilene, the hiring of 2 additional hands for the autumn, the mending of fences that had been deferred through the illness season when her father had been too sick to supervise, and she had been too exhausted to insist. She drove herself through it with the particular fury of someone who does not have time to think about the things she would prefer to be thinking about. And then, on the 21st day after her return from Abilene, a letter arrived with a Fort Worth postmark. It was not the formal agreement. That came separately, addressed to Judge Beeman as promised. The letter was separate, written in the same clean hand she had recognized from the draft agreement at the Thornton house. She sat down at the kitchen table and read it. He wrote well. Not flourishingly, nothing in his manner was given to unnecessary ornamentation, but well in the way of a man who respects language and uses it precisely. He told her that Crane had approved the agreement with minor modifications and that Judge Beeman's copy was in the mail. He told her that the Ridley parcel purchase had been finalized. He told her that the initial survey for the secondary water channel had been completed and looked promising. And then, in the last paragraph, he wrote, "I find myself thinking about the conversation at the Grand Hotel more often than is probably appropriate for a man who has a great deal of practical work to occupy him. I am not entirely sure what to make of that, but it seems honest to mention it rather than confine this letter entirely to business matters. She read that paragraph 3 times. Then she put the letter down on the table and looked out the kitchen window at the south pasture, where 2 of the hands were mending the fence she had ordered repaired, and she thought about honesty as a quality the way he had named it so plainly, the way it lived in him not as a performance but as a simple fact of his nature. She wrote back the same evening. Her letter was largely about the ranch, the cattle drive preparations, the pump repair that had been more complex than anticipated, the unseasonably dry conditions, and what they might mean for the winter grazing. It was professional and practical, and it told him, in the way that practical things tell the truth, exactly who she was and how she lived. And at the end she wrote, "I find I also think about that conversation more than my schedule reasonably permits. It is good to know I am not the only one." Letters went back and forth across the distance between Dodge City and Fort Worth with a frequency that the postal riders on that route probably noticed and said nothing about. They wrote about cattle and water and weather and the politics of the open range, which was changing fast under the pressure of the newly arrived farming families who had come west with their homestead claims and their barbed wire and their absolute determination to stay. They wrote about other things too. He wrote about Texas, the particular beauty of the hill country in spring, the way the rivers there ran clear over limestone beds, the years when the Longhorn drives had first opened, and there had been something that felt like genuine freedom in the occupation. She wrote about her father, not the grief of losing him, which was private, but the man himself, the stories that made him specific and real and irreplaceable. He wrote about his family, a mother still living in Lampasas, a younger sister married to a schoolteacher in San Antonio. She learned that he had been engaged once, briefly, to a woman who had ultimately preferred a man with less geography between them. She recognized the shape of that kind of ending, the practical failure of feeling that lives too far from what it loves. In October, he wrote to say that he would be traveling through Dodge City in November on business related to the Ridley operation, and that he would be obliged if she would allow him to call on her at the ranch. She wrote back, "I would be considerably more than obliged." He arrived on a Thursday in the second week of November, the sky above the Kansas plain the deep washed blue of autumn, the wind carrying the first real cold of the season down from the north. He rode in on a bay horse that was a fine animal, well kept, well mannered, the kind of horse a man chose when he planned on traveling distances and needed to trust what was under him. Cole was in the yard splitting wood when Fletcher rode up, and she watched from the porch as her brother straightened and set down the axe and looked at the approaching rider with the frank assessment of a young man protecting his sister's household. She had told Cole about the Ridley agreement. She had not told him about the letters. Fletcher dismounted, introduced himself to Cole with a handshake that had the quality of genuine respect rather than obligatory courtesy, and said something that made Cole look surprised and then nod, which told her the something had been worth saying. She descended the porch steps and walked toward them. Fletcher turned when he heard her footsteps on the gravel, and the look that crossed his face in the unguarded moment before he composed it was the most informative thing she had ever seen a face do without intending to. "Opal," he said. "James," she said. Cole looked between them with the quick, sharp intelligence of a teenager who notices everything and says nothing, and then announced that he had better check on the horses and disappeared toward the barn with the studied casualness of someone being deliberately tactful. She almost laughed. "He's a good young man," Fletcher said. "He is," she said. "Come inside. It's cold." The kitchen of the Atwood ranch house was the heart of the place, wide and warm, smelling of the coffee she had put on when she saw the rider from a distance, with a long table that seated 8, and had never seated fewer than 6 for as long as she could remember. She poured the coffee and they sat across from each other at the near end of the table, and for a moment neither of them spoke. looking at him in the actual three-dimensional space of her kitchen. After 4 months of letters and memory, she was aware of how precisely she had been carrying him in her mind. Every detail she had catalogued in Abilene was still accurate: the quality of his attention, the careful weight of his words, the way he occupied space with a settled certainty that was not dominance but simply presence. "You look tired," he said. "It's November on a working ranch," she said. "Everyone looks tired." "Fair enough," he said, and drank his coffee. "The Ridley Agreement held up, Judge Beeman tells me." He was satisfied with the language, she said. "The Channel Survey, when does that work begin?" "Spring," he said. "As soon as the ground is workable. I've hired a local man, Tanner, who knows the watershed. He's confident the channel can be developed in a single season." She nodded. Business discussed. The other thing still waiting, the way things that are waited for become more present the longer they're kept waiting. "I read your letter about your father's boots," he said suddenly. "The pair he wore the day you were born." She looked up. She had written that in September, a small story about finding her father's good boots in the back of the closet while searching for a bridle, and how she had sat down on the closet floor and held them for an unreasonable amount of time. She had not expected him to remember it specifically. "He said he wore them to be ready," she said, "in case the doctor was slow getting there and he had to go himself for the midwife." "And did he?" "He did," she said. "Rode 4 miles in the dark in those boots and brought Mrs. Hennessy back in time." "That's a good story," he said. "It's a good man it was about," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was not a complicated gesture. It was the simplest possible gesture for a situation that required an acknowledgement that grief and love and the carrying of loss were real and visible and deserving of touch. She looked at his hand on hers. Large, brown from the sun, a small scar on the knuckle of the first finger that she had not noticed in Abilene but noticed now. She turned her hand over beneath his and let her fingers curl around his palm. "James," she said. "Yes," he said, "just that, just the affirmation. I have been very careful," she said, "for a very long time about what I allow myself to want." "I know," he said, "I have been the same." "This ranch is my responsibility," she said. "Coal is my responsibility. The debts my father left are my responsibility. I am not in a position to—" She stopped. "Start it again." "I am not in a position to be careless." "I'm not asking you to be careless," he said. "I am asking very carefully whether you would permit me to court you, formally. With your knowledge and your brother's knowledge and no ambiguity about what I mean by it." She looked at him. The autumn light through the kitchen window was kind to him, as she suspected most kinds of light were. "Fort Worth is a long way from Dodge City," she said. "It is," he said, "though Fort Worth is not necessarily permanent." Something in her caught on that. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, with the measured honesty she had come to expect from him, "that I have been in Crane's employ for 6 years, and I have put enough aside that the question of whether I work for him or for myself is not as fixed as it once was. The Ridley parcel is just the beginning of Crane's northern expansion. He needs someone in this region. He offered me the position of Northern Operations Manager, which would be based," he paused, "in Dodge City." She was very still. "When did he offer you that?" she said. "August," he said, "when I told him about the water arrangement I had made with you. And you took it." "I told him I would give him an answer by January," he said. She looked at the table, at his hand still holding hers, at the worn grain of the wood that had been her father's table and his father's before that. Outside she could hear Cole resuming his wood splitting, the rhythmic crack carrying clearly through the cold air. "I don't want you to take a position in Dodge City because of me," she said. "That is precisely the kind of thing I meant when I said I have to be careful." "I know," he said, "and I want to be clear, the position makes business sense for Crane independent of any personal considerations. The northern operations are expanding. He needs a man he trusts here. That is real regardless of the other thing." "The other thing," she repeated with a faint, dry note. His mouth made that curve that was almost a smile. "The other thing," he confirmed. "Which is that I have been thinking about you since July and have found no productive way to stop. and would rather spend the next 6 months proving whether that amounts to something real than wonder about it from Fort Worth for another year. She looked at him for a long time. The fire in the kitchen stove made a comfortable sound. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with the quiet persistence of Kansas autumn. "You may court me," she said, "properly. With the understanding that properly in my situation means slowly and honestly and with Cole's knowledge and without any assumptions about outcomes." "Those are exactly the terms I was hoping for," he said. She smiled. It was the third time she had smiled at him, and this one was the warmest of the three, full in the way of someone who has been holding something carefully at arm's length and has finally allowed it to come a little closer. He stayed 3 days. He slept in the ranch's spare room, which had been the foreman's room before the last foreman went to work for a larger operation to the north. And he was so consistently and unemphatically correct in his conduct that Cole, who had been watching with the sharp vigilance of someone who loved his sister and intended to protect her, gradually shifted from assessment to simple observation. On the second evening, Cole asked Fletcher, at the supper table, what his intentions were. He asked it with the directness of a young man who has been thinking about how to frame the question for 24 hours and has decided that direct is better. Fletcher told him. He said that he respected Opal's judgment and her capability completely, that he was asking for the opportunity to know her better over time, that he had no intention of interfering with the ranch's operation or its ownership, and that he understood a man courting a woman with Cole's sister's responsibilities needed to earn trust rather than assume it. Cole nodded. He thought about this through the rest of supper. Then while they were washing up Fletcher at the washing tub, Cole at the drying, he said quietly to Fletcher, "She gave up a lot when Pa died. She doesn't say so, but she did." "I know," Fletcher said. "I just want her to be happy," Cole said. "Not just running things, actually happy." "So do I," Fletcher said. Cole handed him the last dried plate and considered this. "All right," he said. "Then we're agreed on the most important thing." When Fletcher rode out on the third morning, he and Opal stood by his horse in the yard in the cold gray dawn light, and he held both her hands in his and looked at her with the full, serious attention she had first noticed in the cattlemen's hall in July. "I'll be back in December," he said. "If that suits." "It suits," she said. He pressed her hands once, released them, mounted his horse, and rode south through the winter grass. She watched until the bay horse was a small dark shape against the horizon, and then she went back inside to the warm kitchen, and she stood at the stove with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and felt something she had not felt in 6 years of careful, responsible, grief-seasoned living. Hope, plain and warm and completely uncomplicated by caution. He came in December, and he came in February, and in April he accepted the position with Crane's Northern Operations and moved to Dodge City with a leather trunk and a spare saddle, and the practicality of a man who does not travel with more than he needs. He took a room at the boarding house on the eastern end of town, which was reputable and within the bounds of propriety, which mattered in Dodge City in 1874, the same way it mattered everywhere in 1874. He came to the ranch twice a week, which was as often as the work of both their operations permitted. He learned the Atwood land the way he learned everything, with patience and genuine attention. He knew within a month where every fence line ran, which pastures were stronger in dry years and which in wet, which of the hands were reliable and which required supervising, and which of the 3 barn cats was the one that actually caught mice. Her name was Duchess, and she was the smallest of the 3, and Fletcher, who did not make a performance of affection for animals but clearly had it, could be found on more than one occasion sitting on the barn steps in the evening with Duchess settled in his lap, discussing nothing in particular with the cat, while Opal watched from the kitchen window and felt something in her chest do the kind of thing that hearts do when they have decided, ahead of the mind's permission, that a thing is settled. In June of 1874, almost exactly 1 year after the cattlemen's haul in Abilene, Fletcher asked Cole Atwood for his blessing before he asked Opal. He did it one afternoon while they were both mending the south fence, working side by side in the summer heat, and Cole later told Opal about it with an expression she could only describe as fierce approval. He asked Opal on the evening of the same day. They were sitting on the porch in the long summer light, the prairie stretching out before them in the gold of late afternoon, and he turned to her from his chair with the settled certainty she had recognized in him from the first moment and said, very quietly, "Opal, I would like to ask you to marry me, not because it is the next practical step or because it solves any problem of logistics. Because I love you and I believe you are the best person I have ever known, and I would like to spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of being in the same category." She turned to look at him. The light was on his face. His hands were still, his expression was open in the particular way she had learned to read as his version of vulnerability, not performed, not defended, simply present. "James," she said. "Yes." "Yes," she said. "That is my answer. Yes." He reached out and took her face in both his hands with a gentleness that was somehow also a certainty, and he kissed her for the first time, there on the porch of the Atwood ranch in the evening light, and it was the kind of kiss that answers questions you did not know you had been asking. When he pulled back, her hands were gripping the front of his shirt in a way she had not consciously decided to do. "Good," he said, very quietly. "Good." They were married in September of 1874, in the small church in Dodge City, on a Saturday morning that was clear and gold, and carried that particular quality of autumn light that makes everything it touches look like it has always been exactly right. Cole walked her up the aisle, tall in his good suit, his face the combination of happiness and grief, and pride that faces make at weddings when the person being married is someone you love and someone you miss is not there to see it. Opal wore a dress that had been her mother's cream wool, altered by the seamstress in Dodge City to fit her more closely than it had been made to fit anyone, with small pearl buttons down the back. She carried a bunch of late wildflowers from the ranch's east meadow, tied with a ribbon Cole had bought without being asked. James Fletcher stood at the end of the aisle in his good black coat and watched her come toward him with an expression that was so completely open and so entirely his that she thought she might not make it to the altar without losing her composure entirely. She made it. Her hand in his was steady. His eyes held hers the entire way through the vows, and she held his, and the minister's words fell around them like something being officially confirmed rather than newly created. After the ceremony, the small reception at the Dodge City Hotel was attended by Judge Beeman and his wife, Tom Pierce, who had given Opal her market information before the Abilene trip, and who was both genuinely pleased and slightly moved by the whole proceeding, two of the ranch hands who had been with the Atwood operation for years, and several neighbors who came with the easy good will of communities that have weathered enough together to genuinely celebrate each other's good fortune. Samuel Crane had sent a letter of congratulations and a case of whiskey, which arrived 3 days before the wedding, and which Fletcher received with the dry acknowledgement that Crane had finally done something purely generous. Cole, at the reception, gave a toast. He stood up with his glass and he was quiet for a moment, finding the words, and then he said, "My father used to say that the measure of a thing was whether it made you better than you would have been without it. I think that's the right measure for a marriage, too. And I can say that watching my sister over this past year, I think she has found something that makes her better. Not because she needed improving, because she has never needed improving, but because she is more herself when he is in the room." He stopped. "I think my father would have been glad," he said. "That's all." Opal reached across the table and squeezed her brother's hand, and he squeezed back, and Fletcher, beside her, put his arm around her shoulders with the easy certainty of a man who belongs exactly where he is. They spent the first winter of their marriage in the ranch house, Fletcher having given up his Dodge City room without ceremony, the business of the Crane Northern operations requiring his presence in the region anyway, and making the arrangement practical by any measure. But practicality, by that point, was simply the container. What was inside it was something else entirely. The winter was harsh. January brought blizzards that kept them housebound for days at a stretch, which should have been a test of the marriage, and was instead something entirely different: long evenings by the kitchen fire, conversations that went wherever they wanted to go, the discovery of the specific private world that two people build when they have time and warmth in each other. He played chess badly and learned from her quickly. She played the piano adequately, and he listened with the full attention he gave to everything, sitting in the chair by the window with his coffee, and she found herself playing better because he was listening. He told her, during those long winter evenings, about things he had not written in letters. About the years after his father's death, when he had been 20 and responsible for a grieving mother and a younger sister, and a ranch that was barely viable, and the weight of that, and the particular way that weight changes a person, makes them capable and also cautious, makes them strong in ways that sometimes feel like walls. She understood this with the intimacy of someone who has been made by the same kind of fire. "We are the same kind of person," she said one evening, looking at him over the chessboard. "We are," he said, "which means we understand each other's silences. And we know how to wait," she said. "And we know how to work," he said. "And we know what matters," she said. He moved his chess piece, looked at her, and said, "You." Simple, just that, just the word and the certainty behind it. Spring came as it always does, first in the smell of the air, then in the color of the grass, then in the full-throated return of everything that had been waiting under the cold. The channel work on the Ridley side began in March and was completed by May, exactly as promised, and the secondary water source came in at twice the capacity Tanner had estimated. Fletcher wrote to Crane with the satisfaction of a man whose arrangements have held, and Crane wrote back with the brief, gruff approval of a man who does not waste words on compliments but gives them when they are warranted. Cole, that spring, began to come into his own in ways that were visible and rapid. He was 18 now, and the ranch work fit him differently than it had at 17, with authority rather than effort, as though he had grown into the size of the responsibility. He and Fletcher had developed the easy, functional relationship of men who respect each other's knowledge and complement each other's gaps. Cole knew the Atwood land the way only someone born to it can know land. Fletcher knew the broader business of the trade in ways that Cole's education had not yet reached. Together, they were better than either was separately. Opal watched this with a gratitude she could not entirely express, because what she was grateful for was not just the partnership but what it gave her. The ability, for the first time, to look at the ranch's future and believe it would be well without her being the only one holding it. She was also by April aware of something else. She told Fletcher on a Thursday evening in May, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the spring air coming through the open window and the sound of the barn settling into its night sounds. She said it simply, the way she said most things, directly, without preamble, with the confidence of someone who has decided that the truth is better delivered than withheld. "We're going to have a child," she said. He went very still. And then the expression that moved across his face was so completely uncomplicated that it was almost startling, pure, undisguised, undefended joy. "When?" he said. "October," she said, "or thereabouts." He reached across the table and took her hands, the same way he had reached across the table in her kitchen in November 2 years ago, and she felt the echo of it. How different it was this time, same gesture, different world. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I intend to continue being perfectly well." "Of course you do," he said with the warmth that had become the constant temperature of life with him. "Of course you do." Cole, when he was told, made a sound that was half laugh and half something raw, and then said, "Pa would have been beside himself." And this was so exactly true that all three of them sat with it for a moment, the gentle, permanent weight of the loved person who was not there. The summer of 1875 passed in the full, abundant rhythm of a working ranch in a good year. The cattle were healthy. The south fence held. The new water channel on the Ridley side kept its promise. Fletcher's work for Crane's northern operations was going well, which meant that the income from that position supplemented the ranch revenues in ways that allowed Cole to hire a third permanent hand, and Opal to order the books she had been wanting, a set of agricultural ledgers from a publisher in St. Louis, and two novels she had been told were worth reading, one of which she finished in 4 days and pressed into Fletcher's hands, saying he had to read it immediately. He did, and they talked about it for a week. In October, on a cool night when the moon was full over the Kansas prairie and the midwife, Mrs. Callahan, had been at the ranch house since afternoon, the first child of Opal and James Fletcher was born. It was a boy. He was large and healthy and loud, which the midwife said with satisfaction was exactly what you wanted, and when he was placed in Fletcher's arms, still wrapped in the flannel Mrs. Callahan produced from her bag, Fletcher looked at his son with an expression of complete bewilderment and absolute love. "Henry," Opal said from the bed, watching her husband hold their son. Fletcher looked at her. "After my father," she said. "Henry," he repeated, and the name in his voice had the quality of a thing being installed in its permanent place. Cole met his nephew in the doorway of the bedroom when Mrs. Callahan allowed it, and he held him with the careful, concentrated attention of someone who understands they are holding something important, and he said nothing at all for a long time, which was its own kind of eloquence. Henry Fletcher grew quickly, the way ranch babies do, fed on good air and constant activity, and the particular nutrition of a life lived largely outdoors. He was, by all accounts, a remarkably good-tempered child, which Opal attributed to the fact that he had never, from his first hour, been in a place where he was not loved and attended to. He had his mother's auburn coloring and his father's gray-green eyes, and by the time he could walk, he was already attempting to follow the working dogs around the barnyard with the absolute conviction that he belonged in whatever was happening. Fletcher, watching his son attempt to herd the chickens one afternoon with the focused seriousness of a working cattleman, said to Opal, "He's going to be more trouble than both of us combined." "Obviously," she said. "He has our genetics." He laughed, a full, unguarded laugh, the kind that she had learned to love above all his other sounds, because it was the one that required no reserve at all. The years that followed built on each other with the solidity of good construction. In 1877, a second child arrived, a girl, whom they named Clara, after Fletcher's mother, with a temper that was immediately evident and a laugh that she shared freely from the beginning, which convinced everyone who met her that she was going to be magnificent. Henry, at 2, regarded his sister with the cautious interest of someone who had not been consulted about this change to his household and was reserving judgment. Cole married in 1878. Her name was Ruth, and she was the daughter of one of the farming families who had settled to the north of Dodge City, which was itself a small symbol of the shifting landscape of the plains, cattlemen and farmers finding accommodation, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes with genuine warmth. Ruth was practical and funny, and could ride as well as any of the hands, which Cole had apparently considered an important qualification. The ranch, which had been Opal's sole responsibility in that terrible summer of 1873, had become something larger, a family enterprise again, with more hands than it had ever had and more cattle than it had run in its best years under her father. Fletcher had, somewhere in the middle years of the decade, made a private arrangement with Crane to reduce his operations management role to a consulting capacity, which gave him the bulk of his time for the Atwood operation, and which Crane accepted with the pragmatic recognition that keeping Fletcher happy was worth more than keeping him on the original terms. In 1878, on a September afternoon very like the one 5 years earlier when she had stood at the altar of the Dodge City Church and said her vows, Opal was in the kitchen putting up the last of the summer preserves when Fletcher came in from the range, dusty from the day's work, and stopped in the doorway and watched her for a moment before she noticed him. When she turned and saw him standing there, hat in his hand, looking at her with the full, unhurried attention that had first caught her notice in a smoke-filled negotiation room in Abilene. She felt the same specific gravity she had felt that first evening, the pull of something that had chosen her as surely as she had chosen it. "What?" She said. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." "At what?" "At my wife," he said, "in our kitchen in our home." She set down her preserve jar and crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, dusty coat and all, and he held her with both arms, and the children were somewhere in the yard. She could hear Henry's voice raised in some declaration of authority over the chickens that Clara was clearly disputing, and the kitchen smelled of summer fruit and spices. And outside, the September light was doing what September light does in Kansas, which is to turn the whole world gold. "Do you know," she said, her face against his shoulder, "that when I walked into that hall in Abilene I was thinking about absolutely nothing except the cattle price." "I know," he said. "That was part of what was so remarkable about you. You were watching me from the moment I came through the door." "I was," he said, without embarrassment. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was choosing words with care. "Because you walked into a room where you were not expected and were not welcome," he said, "and you walked to the head of the table as though you had every right to be there, which you did. But you moved as though you knew it, and that was different from how most people move in rooms where they are not expected." She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him. "And what did you think?" "I thought," he said with the faint near smile that had become over the years as familiar to her as her own reflection, "that whoever this woman was, I very much wanted to know her." "And now you do," she said. "And now I do," he said. "Entirely, and it is considerably better than I imagined." She kissed him. It was a comfortable kiss, the kind that belongs to long knowledge rather than new discovery, but it was no less warm for that, perhaps warmer, because familiarity and love, when they grow together in the same soil, become something that neither one is alone. Outside, Henry's voice hit a new pitch of indignation, and Clara's laugh rang out bright and unrepentant, and the September light lay golden over the Atwood ranch, their ranch, all of theirs, and the prairie rolled away in every direction under the wide, clear Kansas sky. That evening, the whole family sat at the long kitchen table, Opal and Fletcher and Henry and Clara, and Cole and Ruth, who had come over from their part of the ranch house where they had been living since the marriage, and Ruth's belly already showing the next generation beginning to make itself known. 8 places at the table, the lamp in the center burning steady and warm, the food plain and good and plentiful. Fletcher, at the far end of the table from where Opal sat, she still thought of the head of the table as her father's, and sat at the opposite end out of a private loyalty that he had understood from the first without being told, looked at her across the length of the table, over the heads of the children and through the lamplight, with an expression she had been learning to read for 5 years and still found new layers in. She held his look for a moment. Then she smiled, the wide, full, unguarded smile that he had, over the course of years and shared work and grief and joy, and the daily particular intimacy of a real life shared, entirely won from her. He smiled back, and it was the full smile, the one that opened his face and made everything in it available at once. "All right," Cole said, looking between them with the long-suffering affection of a younger brother who has witnessed this kind of exchange approximately 10,000 times and has become accustomed to it. "Let's say grace before the food goes cold." Laughter went around the table, and they said grace, and they ate, and the lamp burned warm between them all. Later that night, when the children were in their beds and the house had settled into its night quiet, Opal sat at the kitchen table alone for a few minutes in the way she sometimes did, the daily accounting of a mind that runs at full capacity and needs the still end of the day to finish its tallying. Fletcher had come through earlier and kissed the top of her head and told her not to stay up too late, which was his nightly form of caring and had been from the beginning. She sat with her hands around a cooling cup of tea, and she looked at the kitchen, the worn table, the good stove, the shelves of preserves, the 2 small boots by the door that belonged to Henry and were already getting too small, the drawing Clara had made and pinned to the wall beside the window, the ledger she and Fletcher had been working through together, two sets of handwriting in the columns, his and hers, practical and intermingled and impossible to separate. She thought about a July morning in Abilene, walking through a door into a room full of men who had not expected her and had not wanted her, and had done their best to diminish her. She thought about the contract in her satchel and the $4.10 per head, and the moment she had shaken Silas Brandt's hand and known, with the certainty of something earned, that she had not failed. She thought about a man at the far end of a table who had been watching her with gray-green eyes, who had spoken up at the precise moment when acknowledgement was needed, who had offered her supper and walked her home 3 blocks through the Abilene night, and looked at her with a quality of attention that was, she now understood, exactly what she had been without and not entirely known it. She had walked into the cattlemen's hall that day looking only for a fair price. She had left with the better deal and his complete attention, and the better deal had been more than any of them in that smoke-filled room could have anticipated. She set down her teacup. She turned down the kitchen lamp. She walked down the hallway of the house her father had built, past the room where Henry slept with his arm flung out across the quilt in the sprawling confidence of a healthy child, past the room where Clara had her small fist curled under her chin in some private dream, to the room that was hers and James's, their room in their house on their land, under their sky. He was still awake, reading by the bedside lamp, which she had expected. He looked up when she came in, and the lamplight was warm on his face, and she stood in the doorway for just a moment, looking at him. "Well," she said. "Well," he said, setting down his book. She crossed the room and got into bed beside him, and he put out the lamp, and the dark was full of the sounds of the ranch at night, the wind in the dry grass, the horses settling in the barn, the infinite particular silence of the open plain. His hand found hers in the dark, the same way it had found it across the table in November, the same way it had found it across every distance since. She held it. Outside, the Kansas sky was full of stars, the same extravagant sky that had been overhead the night he walked her home from the Grand Hotel, the same sky that had watched her drive cattle and bury her father and sign her name to contracts and stand at an altar and hold her children for the first time. It was her sky. It had always been her sky, but it was better, she thought, with his hand in hers. It was entirely, completely, irreversibly better. And somewhere south of them, the trail that ran past the Atwood land was quiet in the night, waiting for spring and the next drive and the next generation of boots on its worn path, and the cattle in the home pasture were still, and the creek ran clear along the boundary line, and everything that needed to be well was well, and everything that needed to be whole was whole, and the long story of the Atwood ranch had turned a corner on a July morning in 1873 and come out, as good stories do, exactly where it needed to be.